As you know by now, Football Manager 2026 is an absolute disaster. And as you know, the new user interface is the worst that it could possibly be. Now, in my opinion, the revamped 3D engine is also just not good enough to justify the price for this game. So anyway, if you're like me, you're probably thinking about ditching FM26 if you haven't already, maybe going back to FM24 or maybe even an earlier game. But the problem is, what if you've already played those games to death? Well, if you're in that category, there are a bunch of different editor data files and scenarios that you can mess around with. Now, my personal favorite Football Manager 2024 add-on is this one. This is the World Super League. This one's a lot of fun because you wind up with over 1,200 clubs to choose from in a single league structure with finances that work really well and a whole bunch of other nice things. Actually, if you haven't noticed yet, the majority of the saves that I run use this scenario. And I've got a lot of new ideas for that one that I'll be exploring in the future, assuming I ever have time to play my current save. But sometimes you want to do something that's a little bit more down to earth and realistic. In fact, sometimes what you really want to do is you want to do a save that's really historically accurate instead of something that's, a total fantasy. And fortunately, you do have some choices. Now, you can always dive into the pregame editor yourself and spend hours upon hours coming up with your own scenario. Or you can spend a bunch of time making major changes to somebody else's scenario. Fortunately, you don't really need to do that. Instead, you can always look around the community for past scenarios and changes that other people have already created. And I'm not just talking about the mad scientist, though his work is probably the most prominent in the FM retro community. There are other projects out there that are definitely worth checking out. And so here's a list of 5 that at least look pretty interesting to me. Now, while each of these are interesting in their own right, since you're playing with vintage players, they're even more fascinating when you know the historical context. Now, there are a lot of countries in each of these data files. So for the sake of making this a little bit easier and more straightforward, I'm only going to focus on England. Well, England and the United States for the first one. Anyway, let's just jump in. The first one on our list is a total conversion for the old Championship Manager 01-02 game. Now, this is a complete transformation of the old Championship Manager game and goes further than any retro database I've seen anywhere else. This mod adds in playable leagues from over 24 countries, and it's really impressive. So this is your opportunity to play with some of the most legendary players of the mid-80s. Or, if you like, you can see if your coaching can change the course of history for some legendary wonder kids. And we're talking about a massive change, a database with an overall player count that rivals the original Championship Manager 01-02 database. Now, this really is a big deal, even though the Football Manager community in general hasn't paid that much attention to it. This has the original league structures all taken care of, plus original league names, and unlike the other retro databases on this list, this actually allows you to start your game in 1984. And that's perfect if you really want to dive into the way that things once were. Of course, the prospect of coaching in East Germany is probably pretty attractive, but there's more to it than just that. In England, FA Cup champions Everton beat rivals Liverpool in the Charity Shield, setting the stage for a magical season. After a massive win away from homes against Spurs in early April, it looked like Everton was going to march to the league title. It was this win against QPR that won Everton the league in early May, and by a pretty wide margin. Despite losing 3 of its 4 final matches, Everton won the title by a decisive 13 points, and Liverpool managed to overtake Spurs for the second spot. So that season, Everton only lost 6 matches all year. That includes 3 after the shouting was over. You could try to go for a perfect season, or you could try to play the spoiler, see if you can get Spurs to lead the entire way. However, in my opinion, the United States part of this database is even more interesting than England. As you probably know, 1984 was the final season in the history of the North American Soccer League. The NASL was still a really wild league, but its last hurrah came during that 1984 season. Now, the NASL did put up a pretty good and wild fight, but this was the end of the singing. Now, if you've ever wondered what might have happened if the NASL hadn't disappeared and instead had merged with the American Soccer League, well, you can find out here. And this part is actually really well done. It's not all that realistic, however, since there are 12 teams. And if you look closely, you'll notice that these teams are all listed as being in the ASL, or the American Soccer League. Now, in reality, the ASL had 6 teams in 1983, which was its final season. Meanwhile, the NASL was down to 9 teams that year and had an abbreviated playoff. The 3-conference structure in the ASL in this league never existed in the real-life ASL. This seems to be loosely based on the 1983 NASL 12-team setup, though a number of the teams have changed. Anyway, regardless, this is your chance to play with the legendary New York Cosmos as well as the NASL back when there were still a bunch of foreign superstars. So in my opinion, the United States part of this patch alone is worth the installation. I really highly recommend giving it a try and check out the link in the description. Anyway, we're going up to FM24 now and to some mods that are going to be maybe a little bit easier for you to install. Next on my list is this 1952-53 retro database, which is absolutely worth looking at. Of course, this is the year that Arsenal beat out Preston North End by the thinnest margin in the history of the Football League. Preston hosted Arsenal in the second-to-last match of the season with the league all but decided. However, Preston won an absolutely famous 2-0 victory, and it looked like they might surprise everybody with a league title. And this really was one of the closest title races in history. So while I was doing research for this video, I was pretty surprised to find out that there were newspapers all over North America, including the United States and Canada, that had articles about this title race. It's certainly not what I expected to find. Anyway, Preston won his final match of the season against Derby County 1-0. However, because of the bizarre way the schedule worked that year, Arsenal's final match didn't come until May 1st. Arsenal scored 3 goals in the first half against Burnley, but still had a hard time holding on for a 3-2 victory in the end. And in the end, Arsenal won the league title on goal average, scoring a minuscule 0.1 more goals per game. Now, there's one problem with this database, and it's really not the fault of the guy who made it. The problem is that you can't use the original schedule. The real-life Preston North End schedule had some real oddities, including 3 matches in a 4-day stretch. This is something that would give any football manager a nightmare. Not only do the matches start here in 2022, but the season arrangement is a lot different than in real life. However, this is your chance to play with all sorts of legendary stars and to take on one of the most difficult challenges in the history of the sport. Now, I should also note here that the 1952-53 database is only available as a save file, so this means that you won't be able to hop in to mess around with the database itself. I don't know why the creator did it this way. I don't know if he offers it to Patreon people or something like that. Maybe he was using someone else's work, didn't want to fess up to it. There's a whole bunch of things that could be going on. Anyway, regardless, the next database on this list is an all-time classic. Next up is the 1966-67 database, and this is one that Mad Scientist worked on. Now, if you know the history of Manchester United, you know that this was the last golden season. The thing is, though, that United seemed to have a knack for blowing big leads this season. Now, if you just look through the results, you will notice an unusual number of draws. And this is one of those seasons that might be a lot of fun to replay if you use the more modern points system, with 3 points for a win instead of 2. Anyway, it was Nottingham Forest that offered the biggest challenge to United that year. Of course, this is back when FA Cup matches happened on the same day as league matches, and so Nottingham Forest were busy losing to Spurs in the semi-final, while Manchester United increased its lead in the league. United won its final league title during its run of dominance, though it didn't get that final victory until the next to last game of the season. And yet, this was the last Manchester United title for the next 26 years. Anyway, there are a ton of possibilities here, including several clubs that could play the spoiler and steal the title all the way. Plus, the guys who made this database included what they call a regen file, which I think is supposed to give you some new gens that are actually legendary players. Anyway, it's absolutely worth checking out. Up next is a more modern retro database, but one that is also quite interesting. We technically did have Championship Manager games by 1995, though it was nowhere near what it is today. I mean, Championship Manager 2 came out that September, so you could technically play with this season using the old game if you wanted to. Of course, this version has updated attribute numbers and is almost certainly going to be more realistic. And this was really one of the most amazing finishes in the history of the Premier League, one that almost fell apart at the very end. Blackburn was led by Alan Shearer, who was enjoying his prime years. Blackburn found itself building up a lead over Manchester United not long after the halfway point in the season. But, as happens so frequently, Blackburn found itself struggling during the most important part of the year. Fortunately, though, Manchester United couldn't capitalize. Anyway, this makes me feel a lot better about all of those times that my team blows it in Football Manager on the last day of the season. The end of this season was really crazy. Blackburn had a 2-point lead heading into the final game of the season. Despite losing 2-1 at Liverpool, Blackburn still managed to win his first title since 1914. This is because Manchester United could only manage a 1-1 draw, ending up 1 goal away from a potential league title. So anyway, that's another amazing race, and there really are a lot of possibilities here. So Manchester United also lost the FA Cup final that year, like a couple days later, and months earlier than that, they were nudged out of the Champions League on goal difference at the group stage. So there's a lot of questions about like what you could do if you managed them, or if you managed Blackburn or a couple of other teams to just sort of see what would happen. So anyway, the final database on my list is a little bit unique in that the version that I would love to show you hasn't actually been released yet, but this is a project that you should know about anyway. Actually, if you have a copy of FM14 lying around, you can give this one a shot. This is one of the most famous retro databases in Football Manager history, consisting of a complete restructuring of what the football world was like back in 1991. That means playing in the Soviet Union, East Germany, and a number of Eastern Bloc countries. Now, this is a pretty dated database. I mean, this came out in 2014, so we're talking like, what, 12 years old as of the filming of this video. This is far older than the 1984-85 database I just showed you. But the fascinating thing here is that this is a project that has been updated from time to time over the years. There was an updated version of this Iron Curtain for Football Manager 2020, which took everything back to how it was in 1988. It included comprehensive updates to every nation in Europe as well as China. And almost right after its release, there was talk of an updated version coming out. Now, they've been working on updating this mod for FM24 for several years now. Actually, it was originally going to be for FM22 and then FM23, and you know how it goes. I think I have a feeling why they don't want to do it for FM26, but that's another story for another video. There have been some issues, unfortunately, with people on the team coming down with things like long-term COVID and some other frustrations. But I have full faith that the updated version will be out before too long. Now, to be frank, the delays are partially because the head designer was a little bit too ambitious. There's apparently a lot of good stuff that has been done, including removing second nationalities from certain players and having other players return to their original nations. However, we're still waiting on a few of the bigger asks, and it's not always easy to modify Football Manager to make these things work. Of course, now the coolest part, at least about the plan, is that this takes everything back to how it was before the Bosman ruling. So long story short, this would mean that the days of having tons of foreigners in every team would be over, as well as the days of like teams just sort of snatching players from other teams. International competitions would be limited, and the domestic leagues would actually mean something again. This is the reason why I'm really looking forward to the release of this. Anyway, it's going to take a little while longer, but I really like what I see so far. I still think it's kind of crazy to go down so deep in these league structures, but it will be fun to mess around with this. And my hope is that the pregame editor doesn't get in the way. So anyway, there you have it. There are 5 retro database challenges for you to mess around with while you're staying away from FM26. Well, you can play on 4 of them right now, 3 of them in FM24, and then 1 of them if you put the old Championship Manager back on, and then you can mess with Iron Curtain if you have FM14 or FM20. Now, one thing I really wish that Sports Interactive would do is that they would make it easier to make databases like this. Like I said, you can't even change the starting date of the game, which is really stupid because you would think there'd be an easy thing to put into the game, right? Like, why is it set in stone like this? Anyway, I'm afraid that we're going to have to do it the hard way, especially given what SI's track record has been for changes that are easy, that make a lot of sense. Anyway, give all of this a try because I know that I definitely will.